It's well known that before 1840, the Polynesians who inhabited the New Zealand islands lived in tribes. Each tribe had its own dialect and customs. There were as many differences as there were similarities. But one thing that they all had in common was their class structure. Within each tribe, there was a three-tier class system, and not everyone could be a chief or rangatira as they were known in the native language. With few exceptions, chieftainship was inherited rather than earned through merit or democracy. Ancestry lies at the heart of the tribal class system. Tribal members who are not chiefs were called tutua. I'll refer to them as the common class or simply commoners. Below them was a third class, slaves, usually taken as the spoils of war after a successful attack on another tribe. Revisionists like to soften the reality of pre-colonial native life, but anyone who researches New Zealand history cannot escape the fact that the Polynesian tribes treated each other with a level of brutality unmatched by anything the British Crown ever came close to. Let's take a look at a historical account from 1835, written by a visiting British envoy and sent to New South Wales. It provides insight into the class system and how women, even close relatives, were treated.
The Bay of Islands, New Zealand, is inhabited by three distinct tribes of natives. One at Te Punga, the chiefs of which are Warepoaka and Waikato. One at Kororareka, headed by Pilori, Peria, Wararahi, Eriwa, and Emoka. And one at Kanakana, headed by Ranwiti, Kiwi, and Pomuri. The whole of these chiefs, as well as the tribes to which they belong, have one and the same distinguishing features, of which a rapacious thieving and greedy disposition is a principal one. They are continually on board some of the numerous vessels that frequent their harbour, either to sell their produce or begging a glass of spirits of which they are inordinately fond, but principally to see what payment they can obtain from the master and crew of the vessels by the sale for the time being of their daughters, sisters, and female slaves. This species of traffic is carried on to an immense extent, and not only are many thousands of pounds annually given to them for this branch of commerce, but the owners of vessels also suffer greatly by the bread cask being continually open to them, as well as by the waste and destruction of quantities of fresh provisions, which are daily given to their relations, principally from the cabin table, in order to ensure the continuance on board during the stay of the ship of the temporary wives of the masters and officers.
There's no reason to believe that the native class system in pre-colonial New Zealand was any different from the feudal class system in ancient Britain. A small ruling elite blessed with ancestry rather than individual merit controlled all resources. The rest, the majority, were dependent on them trying to curry favour and survive. The tribal system promoted inequality. Once someone believed they were superior due to their ancestry, they viewed others as lesser and used them instrumentally, whether on a whaling ship or elsewhere. There's nothing unique about how these class systems functioned or the outcomes they produced. Typically, in the native class system, resources were allocated by the chief, first to himself, then to his relatives along whakapapa lines, then to his tribal allies, and the further removed the person was, the less they received. And slaves, well, they were just simply grateful to be alive. The chief's currency was control over land and resources. His power allowed him to dictate where commoners could fish, where they could trap, set up house, and so on. These resources were essential to the commoners, making them valuable to the chiefs who controlled them. Colonialism devastated the native class system. It changed everything. Commoners were no longer bound to their tribe. They could travel freely into what used to be other hostile tribal lands. They could work in European settlements and participate in the new democratic system. As commoners embraced these new opportunities, tribal resources such as fishing spots and cultivation land became less valuable. Without commoners reliant on them, chiefs lost their influence. The rangatira class system depended on the fealty of commoners, just as European royalty depended on peasants in the feudal system. After 1840, British law and order reduced the need for warriors, undermining the traditional relationship between chiefs and their people. It was a massive shift. Under British rule, commoners could now own their own land and control their own resources. They were free from the grace and favour of tribal chiefs. The authority of the rangatira diminished, and with it their mana, what the English might call grandiosity or ego. Fast forward to the 1970s, about 6 generations after the Treaty of Waitangi, and the old tribal system was almost completely dismantled. Some argue this harmed the descendants of the pre-1840 Polynesian inhabitants. Since the 1970s, a new rangatira class has emerged, politicians and activists who position themselves as ethno-benevolent rangatira. These are the Willie Jacksons and John Tamaheris of today. Unlike traditional rangatira, they've gained power through the British democratic system rather than ancestral whakapapa. This modern tribal system is essentially a political system within a political system, and the interaction between the two, carefully orchestrated by the neo-rangatira, is damaging to New Zealand. The tribal structure has all the hallmarks of communism. It has corruption, nepotism, and authoritarianism, and the system operates within a democracy that values accountability, representative governance, and personal autonomy. The neo-rangatira are the ones heading the trusts and paying themselves and their families eye-watering salaries and awarding themselves favourable government contracts. It's a simple but highly effective grift that has gained momentum since 1975, when the Labour government identified Māori ethnicity as a voter bloc to be courted with identity politics, giving Māori neo-rangatiras tax money in exchange for votes. The neo-rangatira quickly realised that the more they blamed post-colonial settlers for Māori poverty, the more funding they received. The age of white guilt shaming began in earnest. Often you hear complaints such as Māori having fewer years of life expectancy than Europeans, but this ignores the fact that the average Māori lifespan today is 50 years longer than in 1840. All these complaints use European outcomes as a benchmark for Māori disadvantage, while ignoring the enormous improvements Māori have experienced since 1840. Longer lives, better health, higher education, and a far better living standard. In fact, the only negative statistic for commoner Māori people compared to 1840 is overrepresentation in the criminal justice system. And of course, there was no criminal justice system in 1840. The tactics are obvious: misuse of statistics, a few kākois and a haka or two in Parliament, intimidation tactics designed to induce white guilt and extract more funding. But here's the real issue. There's a strong disincentive for the neo-rangatira and their 10 billion in tribal trust reserves to actually improve the lives of Māori commoners. Why? Because if their commoners' social outcomes reach parity with Europeans, the entire funding justification would collapse. Māori commoners cannot be allowed to achieve the same standard of living as Europeans, because that would end the neo-rangatira ethno-grift. The neo-rangatira do not subscribe to the idea of equity between native classes. Rather, they want equity between the European average and the native common class. What the New Zealand taxpayers are doing in this era is funding the rebuilding of the communist tribal system for the neo-rangatira and generating huge personal wealth for them and their new tribal superstructures like Tamaheri's Waiparera Trust. We are funding the destruction of the democracy built by our parents and grandparents over the last 2 centuries. We are, in fact, in a civil Cold War, and we don't appear to be certain of winning. The taxpayer funding hemorrhaging from our democracy and flowing into the neo-tribal communist system is eating our economy from within. One last issue remains: the fate of the former slave class. Today there's a new slave class controlled by the neo-rangatira, but this time it isn't made up of captured warriors. The modern slave class are a whole new breed. If you haven't figured out who they are yet, turn your webcam around. Over 10 billion in tribal wealth has been hoarded by a network of ancestral and neo-rangatira, ensuring their own lives of luxury while using their theoretical tribal commoner class people as political leverage. New Zealand is facing economic ruin. We can't afford the ferries we need. We have issues with defence, healthcare, housing and fuel security, among other things. Yet we continue to pour millions and millions into this ethno-grifting system, thinking it will elevate Māori commoners, when in reality it ensures they remain exactly where they're supposed to be within the native class system as far as the Rangatira are concerned. I think it's time to bust the trusts. If the 10 million in tribal reserves were distributed fairly, nearly every Maori family could afford a home outright. The injection of capital into the economy would significantly help solve our productivity crisis. So is it time to dissolve the native tribes and remove this ethno-communist rot from the core of our democracy? Should we pass a law forcing neo-tribal leaders to distribute the inheritance wealth owed to Maori commoner class people? Can New Zealand survive if we continue with self-inflicted bleeding instead of standing up to the ethno-bullies and their carcoys? What do you think? Leave a comment and let the politicians that stalk the Anglo-Saxon channel know what you're thinking about our political future. Thanks for watching. Give us a like, would you? And do click subscribe to be notified of new content as it drops. See you next time.